Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Practice Forward podcast. I'm your host, Owen, and today we are joined by Scott Bishop, who's the founding principal of Bishop Land Design. He's a landscape architect and human ecologist. Hi, Scott. Good to see you.
Hey, Owen. Good to see you too. Happy to be here today.
Excellent. Yeah, I really look forward to learning about what all this means, because I hear a lot of these words and I don't really understand them as well as I should. Like I'm not even sure what a human ecologist is, but I'm looking forward to finding out. So Scott Bishop designs landscapes as living systems where ecology, equity, and climate resilience converge. As the founding principal of Bishop Land Design, his work spans continents, from coastal marshes in Massachusetts to urban frameworks in Detroit and ecological parks in East Africa. With a background in human ecology, Scott approaches design as a means to recalibrate the relationship between people and place. Formerly a principal at Stoss Landscape Urbanism, where he helped lead the firm to a Cooper Hewitt National Design Award, Scott now focuses on regenerative infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and climate adaptation strategies. His projects like Kincaid Park and President's Coast Resilience Corridor blend community engagement with ecological performance, transforming underutilized spaces into dynamic, inclusive environments. So happy to have you. And just before we get started, I'll just say this episode of Practice Forward is brought to you by Scandaplan. We're the trusted partner for architects who build with precision from what already exists. Scandaplan captures as-built environments and also natural environments with laser accuracy, turning complex sites into clean, usable Revit and CAD models you can trust. Visit Scandaplan.io to see how reality capture is meeting architectural intelligence. So, welcome, Scott. I'm interested. So we were just talking about some of these amazing projects, and you're based in Quincy, Mass, which is I grew up in Massachusetts, and I've always thought, we used to have a boat, and what I've always thought is when you navigate that area in a boat, you understand kind of how it came to be, because all these towns were laid out originally by water, and now the whole thing around all that coastline is so it can take like 2 hours to get someplace that used to take 20 minutes when people were taking boats. Working with it, so you're working with a lot of this coastline, which has been kind of a lot of is really being rediscovered in Boston, especially where they're really love to go hiking and exploring nature.
Yeah, no, this is, we believe that the harbor itself is a piece of critical infrastructure. A lot of our advocacy has been around looking to use the harbor as transit. Like back in the day, I used to take the ferry from Quincy Point all the way over to downtown Boston. 45 minutes, everybody. That's all it took. And you get a newspaper and a coffee with that, and you don't have to do anything. So like all of that is actually really important that we support kind of that marine infrastructure. And we'll talk a little bit later about our Quincy Point project and our Squantum Point project and President's Coast, which all kind of look to leverage that interesting and beautiful combination of ecology and transportation and human interaction. And I know, Owen, like one of your big questions, which is really probably the funniest thing, is if I have to explain landscape architecture, then I really have to explain human ecology, right? Like it's like most people are just understanding what landscape architects do. And then I'm throwing this thing called human ecology.
What is human ecology, Scott?
So human ecology is really understanding how humans live in their environment, which is global, right? Like we're the only species that actually populates the entire globe with our interactions. And so this becomes part of a complex system. And so we have a bunch of tools. First of all, human ecology is a social science. So we are trying to understand ourselves reflectively, almost like in a mirror, and study ourselves just like we would any other species. You can talk about rodent ecology, you can talk about different bird species ecology. All of those have an impact, right, in terms of what they do to their environment, what kind of feedbacks they give, and then also like what things are beneficial, what things are detractors, what happens when populations get too big, what happens when populations get too small. So all of those things really fit into these things called systems dynamics.
Okay.
And so when we think about what we do as a species, that whole thing of system dynamics gets really complex. And so we think about that when we do what I call applied human ecology, which is my practice of landscape architecture. So I take all of that information and then I try to apply that to how we approach certain landscapes, projects, planning projects, even research projects. I mean, broadly based, we are research driven in terms of how we think about and design landscapes from the beginning.
So, and that, so you've taken that approach throughout your career, I imagine.
For sure. Yeah.
And so what constraint or conditions shaped the earliest workflow decisions coming out of human ecology?
So first of all, you have like the physical constraints. I think you've talked about imaging a site, back in the day that was done with a survey. And if you were given a survey, there's not a lot of information there that's going to tell you what that actual site is about.
Yeah.
You talked about digital twins, just in terms of in terms of who's supporting this. And that's like a whole level up to that. And then there's still a gap there in terms of how we think about approach. And that's like the functional of the ecological function of that site and what's really happening. So in terms of thinking about human ecological function, human ecology is happening right now, right? We don't judge that. We just say this is what we're capturing. And what we can say is this is a positive human ecological interaction, or this is a negative human ecological interaction. So that then brings on a whole suite of tools that you might imagine based upon what you talked about, what my firm does. But also, like, understanding the structural constraints are pretty important. So what we see, then we kind of compare with, like, what is the historical aspect of this site? Is that similar or dissimilar to how it's working? And then what are the outcomes of what happens if we start to alter the ecological function? And where are we going? I mean, we can't necessarily go back to where we were. That's a whole timeline situation because maybe some of those constituents no longer exist. And that's problematic, but we still need to come out with a positive outcome. So understanding the structural aspect of that site is like another piece of the tool. And then I would say, like, the final thing that we really try to do is we try to experience the site. Like, every project that I've had, I want to go and I want to check out, but we also then have kind of a checklist of, like, okay, what's going on here? What's the socio-political environment? What are the aims of the client, obviously? And then how does that all mesh with, like, what we could possibly do to make this a more productive environment in terms of human ecology? And there's actually a lot when you start to think about it. And then they have their programmatic needs. So, like, we can mesh all those things together. And so that takes, I would say, one of the best tools, which is the human mind, to understand, like, how to sort all these things. And then also we need that structural aspect. Like, obviously massive trees and things like that we might find. Maybe it's only one tree. Maybe it's a 400-year-old live oak. Like, that's of substance to us. We understand that in its place.
Yes.
And so like that's one aspect of the approach from a structural standpoint. And then we could end up being at another site where it's all invasive species, and even though it has some aspect of productivity, it may not be the highest level of productivity that we can accomplish.
Right.
And then there's that kind of conflict with programmatic needs potentially, and then we try to make sure that we can combine all those together. So then that I think is the final thing when we look towards building things, is like, what is your technological knowledge of the materials that you're using to support that system or systems that then go into the project.
Right. And then I guess for you, in some ways, it's kind of a science fiction type of human ecology as well, because you're doing projects where you're kind of projecting forward, like, what is this space going to look like in 100 years? I mean, I often think when I'm walking around in Central Park and stuff, like how, Frederick Law Olmsted was imagining this when he designed it, and it took 100 years for the tree to really grow to that shape. Or, but I also think probably thinking about how are we going to be interacting with the city? How are we going to be impacting the planet different ways in 100 years from now as well, right?
Yeah, and I would say maybe it's like not so much science fiction as it is like scientific projection.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
And
Yeah.
no, in so much, like, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of sci-fi. Should be no mystery in terms of like what I do and how my brain works, and I love all that. But like, we try to like use empirical knowledge to forward what we know about a lot of things right now in, let's say, how we see like political systems working is not necessarily based in projective scientific knowledge, and so like that is problematic.
Right.
We find value in that regardless, and we work without anybody. We have no political designation as Bishop Land Design. In fact, we just want to make sure that what we are doing, again, is adding to a productive human ecological system. And so in many cases, we are looking at, hydrographs, a very simple thing. Okay, so it's rained this much, and it seems to be over the past 100 years, and there's a weird thing about 1990. Not that I'm again referencing the Matrix, but they were pretty smart about that, or just like right on by accident. But somewhere in the 90s, like, we've seen a great shift in hydrographs. It will be more rain or dramatically less rain. We don't see things that are trending the same. And for that reason, we say, okay, well, you built this system 100 years ago, and it's based for, a 2.5-year storm, and that's your pipe. That's like maintaining all of your storm drainage. Yep. And that pipe actually, it's not going to do the trick for what's happening right now. Or if you think you're going to maintain all of your street trees based upon what you've selected at a certain point in time, that's also not a real fact in a few more years. And so that's what we call like projective scientific thinking. And that is really what you need to do to prepare cities for the types of changes that are ahead. I can add additional information to that, obviously, whether that's climatological models or not, but I can literally look at the existing data up to date and project, based broadly on a curve. Like, you are facing more intense with more water storms than what you've built your city for. So we need to start to think about how we're going to change that, how we're going to change your city for dealing with the reality of today. You could say it's human impact. You could say it's not human impact. For me, it doesn't matter. It's just the data.
Yeah.
So you're just like, you can deny data, and that gets you nowhere, honestly.
Sure.
Or you could use the data, which is what we do when we use all of the different kinds of tools and technologies. at our farm.
Sure. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of different clashes with client expectations that you have to, because if you're coming from a research and science-based approach, it might really not be intuitive for some people in terms of what they think or what they expect, right? But that's really interesting. So now when you're modeling the natural world, so I'm interested because we scan and model the natural world a lot, and we're really working on developing standards that make sense to people like you that are actually valuable. So you were saying like you starting from like a survey when you first began, and so like what kind of a model do you guys have now? If you have a, like, let's say you've got this 70-acre project you're developing called the Points. It's larger than all the public parks in Boston or something like that?
Larger than the Common and the Garden. So like their big Central Park here in Boston. Right. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that there's a lot that's going on with these types of projects. And one of the things that we look at is, okay, we have now, we started working on this project before this model was developed. We have a model now that we work with in Massachusetts, which is the MAFRM. It's basically, we're given this tool. We've all, many of us have trained on that tool to understand like what that means. So, I mean,
this is the tool that for the coastline?
Yeah, so this is based on sea level rise, but it also looks at inundation scenarios. So it will tell you the trajectory of any. So like there's two things that happen. Like sea level rise is a bathtub model, right? Mm-hmm. So that means like, okay, if you were filling the bath, this is the number of feet that you're going to get. But what they add to that is storm inundation and the increased intensity of storm. So then they can model wave heights and flood inundation right into a closed body like a harbor, and they can then model that and see what that means. And that's a really critical tool because it is sanctioned by the state and required for permitting, but also it does then lead to this kind of scenario modeling where you're like, okay, if we're going to maintain habitat and we have these types of events, right, you have that increased storm intensity means that you're going to have increased velocity, and that's going to start to change the habitats that you have. And if we want to support all the coastal fisheries that we have here, all of the great things that you want, whether that's a cod or a lobster or a haddock or mussels or whatever it is that you want from the Northeast, like this arrangement impacts the fisheries. So if we start to build seawalls, you do not have the ecological gradient that is needed to support these environments, because as that water level rises, right, and you go against a flood wall, that gradient, which supplies all of that kind of environment for those hosting critters, is disappearing every time it rises, a minimal amount. And so we need to start to think about like, not just maybe we're fortifying, maybe we're retreating, but if we're going to look at an open space, our opportunity is that we can allow for retreat and re-inhabitation. Right?
So it becomes
these critical environments. So we're going to basically
sanctuary for seafood, kind of.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And all of the things that make this environment so productive. If we just build a bunch of walls, if we build a big wall around Massachusetts, everything that we find great and awesome about the ocean is going to disappear.
Of course, because that all has to do with all the interactions on the perimeter, like you can find in any tide pool in Massachusetts, and all the different life forms that are interacting. And I absolutely see that. So I would imagine a lot of that is integrated with this project in the point.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is, as I was, saying earlier, I think that's actually a good example of what you described as human ecology, right? Where, you live in a city system that was originally navigated by boat, and then it became navigated by cars, and had a completely different impact. And now we're kind of going towards, I don't know, thinking about how people are going to be moving around in 100 years from now, but hopefully it'll be a little more, it'll make a little more sense with the overall ecology of that area you're in.
Yeah.
The harbor. And anyway, so you guys, I was wondering, you're saying that the state of Massachusetts offers this really advanced system for analyzing the coast. Are they also offering any modeling of like topography of land? How do you like have, do you guys have some form of digital twin of like, let's say the 70-acre area or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts has a great GIS repository, actually. I think it's probably one of the best in the United States that I have dealt with, and it's all publicly available. We can download shape files. We can download, in most portions of the state, they have LiDAR at they'll do contours at 1 foot or 2 foot contours that they'll generate from that LiDAR.
Wow,
it's
that's
super
exceptional.
helpful, especially if we're just like trying to suss things out in the beginning of a project. We've had 2 of these veteran memorial cemeteries that we're working on where they had no available existing conditions information, and we started to use that just to kind of figure out like how we would work this out. And I mean, it can be deceptive because then they believe that they have the answer, and we're like, no, we still need existing conditions information. Like we still need a real survey because it's going to be, LiDAR is, 3-meter accuracy, 5-meter accuracy, and that's because they're taking points in that grid system.
Oh, when you say that, they're basically just flying. I think they're just flying over with an airplane that has like a really long range LiDAR device, and it's getting really wide tolerance, right?
So they're getting
also they're getting like the
samples.
canopy of the trees. They're not necessarily getting the actual topography of the land always, because they're scanning from the sky, right?
There's tons of glyphs that happen with that.
Yeah.
I mean, they do definitely scans in the winter, and then they'll do scans in the summer, but yeah, you can't build to that. That's not
right.
But you can get through a concept and be massively closer. And then when I'm working,
you basically use that at kind of a more of a schematic level, right?
Yeah.
And then do you actually go in and do your own scan after that, or?
Yeah, so we've done a couple things. We've both had site LiDAR down to like, I think it's like 2 inches or whatever it is. We did a project in Grand Rapids that had historic facades in Michigan, that had historic facades, and so we wanted to make sure that we were taking into consideration with like tree heights, and we had catenary systems, that we were making sure that everyone could still see the details of these kind of Beaux-Arts buildings. So we wanted to know where those things were at very specifically, and we didn't want to put any attachment points in those zones. And then, quite typically, we will do a survey. We've had some so like that project, we had a digital twin because it was so detailed. And I would say, like, to that extent, it can be a little bit hard to manage that scale of data. And so it's like, all right, we need that data to understand where we're at, but then maybe as a working model, it's like a little bit overly detailed. So like finding that happy medium is really important. Like we use Rhino to get us into the modeling zone, at least in terms of like technical modeling. And in so much, we kind of swap out with CAD and Rhino and kind of go back and forth. But we,
Right.
there you can get highly precise models in Rhino and get them back into CAD and use them.
Sure. Yeah. No, we do a
in
lot of
construction documents, so that's really
we
good.
do a lot of that kind of coordination work where it's like we're working with a whole lot of different firms, different design professionals who are all working in different platforms. So that having a central source of truth for that coordination downstream is really critical. So really everyone's on the same page. So you guys do also a lot of collaborations with architecture firms as well, right? Where you're integrating landscape in with architecture.
Yeah, for sure. We do like as of late now we kind of do every sector, sans healthcare. So we interact often with architecture and architects. And we've been doing quite a bit of museum work, and that's kind of critical to make sure that those systems are integrated. But that means we're also doing interpretive work, and we want to make sure that we're telling the right story. And so that's where I think maybe I'm not again, back to the science fiction thing. Maybe I'm not trying to tell a story about the future. Sometimes we're telling stories about the past.
Yeah.
And so for a project out in New York, we were actually trying to reconfigure their landscape to think about what it might be like if we were in a pre-colonial condition, because they have so many tie-ins to that piece of history, that we wanted to start to tell that piece of history, and not like but it meant to have like an English inspired park, right? Like that wasn't really what they should be talking about, because that didn't reflect what their museum was showing and what they were trying to integrate in terms of that understanding of that place. So we have a lot of unique opportunities to do that, and that's really awesome. And that leads us to kind of like, they have Revit, or they are using some sort of BIM software. And then like most of those softwares have zero interaction with landscape, right? Like they just don't know how to manage topography. They don't know how to like set that. It becomes too big in scale, so that it's trying to do all these precise things that the BIM software wants to do, but it's on different axes, and that becomes problematic. So, again, Rhino helps us to solve that a bit. It's a great translation tool, and it's a shout out for them for sure. But I mean, just saying, it is a really great tool. And then, how do we then get that to integrate? And so there are other softwares we're looking at. I mean, we do want to get into the BIM game, and whether that's like via Python scripts or like Grasshopper. I mean, the thing that we're trying to get most at when we make that translation is carbon accounting. And so if we can have something that like can pull in like EC3's carbon accounting, or we currently use Pathfinder, which does a pretty good job, but we need like environmental product declarations from folks in order to make sure that that thing's doing the right thing. Like, that's where
sorry, just to clarify, these are for structures that you're designing.
So if we can use a standalone, which is Pathfinder, which helps us do that accounting based on square footages, and we need to input all that. If we use a BIM system, whether that's Vectorworks or a Rhino version of that, then we would be able to start to account for our embodied carbon in the landscape. And that's, again, another thing that we do at Bishop Land Design. We're trying to make sure that we can start to shrink that down.
Okay.
Obviously, it always has an impact, but the goal would be is that our landscape, because landscapes do something that buildings don't do, is that they
Yeah.
actually sequester carbon.
Yes,
So
exactly
if
right.
we can make a landscape that we use materials that are near zero or getting
Yeah.
closer to that, and then we
Yeah.
can sequester carbon dioxide, then we come out with a positive outcome for our landscape. Maybe it takes 3 years, maybe it takes 5 years. We try to stay under 30 because that would be like when someone was like, I think we need to redo that. And so like if we can get there, then all of a sudden we're like, okay,
So,
that's
so
positive.
are you
That's
actually
positive human
considering?
ecology right there, right?
Is that one of the factors that you guys consider when you're thinking about uh, plants and foliage? Is that sequestration that it does?
Yeah, so like Kincaid Park, right? Like we introduced really basically wetlands. We designed wetlands that sequester carbon at like 20
Hmm.
times the amount that forests do. And
Hmm.
so like that's a really critical piece of that project in terms of the carbon delta.
Hmm.
And we think about that. It depends on where we are. And that's another thing that we look at in research is like, what are the systems at play and how can we best kind of tie into that? We use a
Hmm.
lot of USDA databases to understand how ecologies work in those areas and like what might be an adaptive human ecology, adaptive ecology that we can use that like integrates with the human ecological system. And so that I think is one of the ways that we kind of move the ball forward and making sure again that we're productive. It's like certain ecologies, it could be a prairie, it could be a sphagnum moss bog, it could be a wetland. These all have like higher deltas than what your normative landscape would be, especially a lawn, which is like not, it's not it's not positive, it's not doing anything great. But we
Yeah.
understand the need for lawns if you're doing programmatic things. So we try to blend all that together and see if we can't get to that positive side of things on a number of levels, because we understand that people need activity and they need to interact with the landscape. That's part of what keeps us healthy as a species.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, so much like up on the North Shore or whatever, but everybody's always living in the marsh, as it were,
That's right.
So, yeah, well, and it's so beautiful too. I mean, just so
Yeah.
gorgeous. I mean, if you haven't been to that part of the world, it's just incredible. But the communities already are. You can't really build on that. So the communities are
Yeah.
all really, really woven around, and that part of the world you live in. It's like the landscape really does define how people live and where the roads are and where you can build so much more than other parts of the world.
Definitely.
So tell me very quickly about this President's Coast project. This is a very long new hiking trail that's kind of using some existing infrastructure to basically create. Looks like a really fantastic walk. I want to check this out. This is underway now.
We're in the planning. We've completed the master plan, and we're looking now to start to build upon that, get through like schematics, and then we'll start to target certain chunks of the plan. It is 8 miles, and it connects Quincy Center, which is actually connected via the MBTA to the Red Line. So like virtually anybody in the Boston metro area could start out in Quincy Center, make their way from the center out to some of the coves
Oh, beautiful.
that exist, and
Yeah.
then into some of these open spaces. There's a Passagonesset Park, which was actually a restoration project by the Army Corps of Engineers to change the way the water flows, but not a lot of infrastructure went in place there. And then we go out and we tie together Germantown and Quincy via the high level sewer, which is actually a really cool piece of infrastructure that was designed by Olmsted and Elliott so
Really?
long ago, right? And
Wow.
so like it's really fun. as a playground, as a landscape architect, to play with, you know, the legacy of these great landscape architects and what they had designed to make sure that communities were healthy and we weren't actually contaminating the best that they could, the cities and towns. And now there's such a great piece of infrastructure by the MWRA that really has completed that in the 90s, and cleaned up Boston Harbor.
Mhm.
So we have all of this kind of playground. It is really all coastal, and marshlands that it's connecting. And it's a multi-use trail. Germantown has a whole host of different types of housing, but it includes low-income housing and transitional housing. So those people would be able to get to services much easier just by taking this trail. So a multi-use trail, it includes bikes and
Wow.
pedestrians. And so, you know, it really becomes this tour of kind of all of that, all of what you described, all of the marsh and the coastal goodies. And I think it connects up to 9 beaches in Quincy. So it would,
these
again,
projects
like,
are really going to be transformative for Boston. That's pretty amazing. Then this project, you said it's not on your website, but you could talk about it. It's a 70-acre project. So when you have, well, first of all, just getting back to the modeling, like, how do you, okay, so, and you were talking earlier about all the different, like, identifying things you want to keep versus the invasive species that you may want to get rid of. And so how do you, when you have 70 acres, how do you actually, like, create an inventory of all the different foliage there?
So, again, Massachusetts has a database in that. And so we're using GIS to identify all of the different types of ecologies that exist. There's been additional research out in that area by Audubon, which supports that, but there's basically an inventory of all of the species that are there, and the habitat types.
How do they do that? Is that some kind of machine learning, or how do they know?
I mean, no, they went out there. People went out there and actually figured out what's happening there. So they can tell by the vegetation type what it might host. So not dissimilar from wetland delineation, but we're talking about a much more specific type of delineation. Okay, like, this is more saltwater based, or this is more freshwater based, and this is the kind of things. These are the habitats that we found. I mean, again, we have a rich community of very smart people that are here. And so, like, those people and their research contributes to this kind of database that exists for the state.
Right. But so when you're redesigning 70 acres, I don't imagine you just go in with a giant rototiller and start over.
No,
right?
For certain. I mean, first of all, we want to maintain those habitats, but this is what gets tricky about it, right?
Right.
Like,
so then
that's going to all change. And so then, then we run up against the wall analogy that I talked about before. So I'll be honest, like, the first time I showed the clients this, they were like, so you're telling me this is all going to be underwater? And I was like, yeah, well, that's what the models say, right?
Is it all going to be, it's 100% going to be underwater, or are you, like, building things to stick out the top or something?
So that's what so there's 2 things that we have to do. There is a community out there of like 10,000 people that we need to make sure that we protect. So, okay. So this is resilience infrastructure. So there's the people. There's all the cool ecologies that exist there currently, but those are going to start to change, right? There's a delta there, and it's not like super fast, but we need to come up with a structure that can allow things to move over time. And so that becomes the basis of our design, right? Like, how do we create a gradient that allows for things to change over time and things to eventually make their way up the gradient?
Yeah.
And, like,
designs the building to be even better underwater.
I mean, people design whatever, engineers, we got to design for 30 years. That's what it says, because it's a structure. And if it collapses, and but they need to maintain it over that period of time. Like maybe some other designers, maybe less time, but like the max time that we normally think of things is like 30 years. But now the state, according to code, is asking us to look at 2070 as we calculate rainfall amounts. And so like that really, and then we're using the MA firm, like all of these things change how we start to think about design over time. And so this thing became really interesting about like how we're thinking about literally an ecological mountaintop theory, like what gets pushed off the top of the mountain and things change in terms of the ecology. So we have the opportunity in terms of resilience infrastructure to say, well, why don't we like build the mountain taller, right? Just for a period of time, so that these things will actually have a place to live.
Yes.
And then that gives us time to think about what we're going to do next.
Right.
Because I think there's going to be ecological and technological changes that exist for those that think about a positive outcome. That can help to change this situation that we're in, this real situation that we're in.
Yeah. Well, it's really all really interesting. I'm starting to really get my head around at least some of the things you have to deal with. I would imagine practicing forward, thinking forward in terms of like, let's say the next 5-10 years of your practice. I would imagine with all this kind of explosion of like AI and new modeling tools and things like that, you're probably going to be able to be even more kind of empirically oriented towards this sort of research that you're doing. It seems like we're finally going to have models that can understand weather better and understand some sort of ecological patterning, maybe a little more accurately. But what do you see coming forward for you that's exciting for you?
So, I mean, one of the tools that we started to use, and they're very complex, and I would teach these tools at Northeastern University when I was a professor there, which are systems dynamics tools, which are really calculus, right? So it's the change in a system over time, and you can put in all of these different inputs. I see that AI is going to be able to actually build probably more adaptive frameworks. Maybe they don't have the right inputs, and that's probably something that should be audited, because it seems to be like, crap in, crap out, let's say, not to be too crass. And so like if you have the right equations, then we're going to be able to use system dynamics in a way that is way more informative in design and human ecology than we have before. And then I would say like, it is, like in terms of AI in general, like that's a big chunk, and I would love to see that happen. And it is still like the climate models and everything that we're already using now, those are still have to be run on supercomputers, right? Like those models are massive. And so like that, I think there will be some interesting adaptations to understand like what it is we can do. And I think that will be one outcome of that. On my scale, I think systems dynamic modeling is like, okay, if I could just take this chunk and then kind of understand more broadly what takes a ton of research to do, and like distill that down into something that I can believe in from that thing, which has tons of hallucinations now and is not super reliable. And then like if that becomes more reliable, that data source and those outcomes, where we can start to play with scenario modeling, which is really what we do when we start to think about designs, I think will be really super interesting. And then, it's still like what we're using right now, whether that's like Adobe AI. I think you're using Gemini right now, which I've used Like it can get you a framework right now, and I hope that the level of detail that framework that it is created becomes more refined. That's where I would start to say now it becomes a really powerful tool for thinking about how we can get feedback from what we're doing.
Mhm.
You mentioned something about science, and then I think what I would say with what we do, we use science fiction comment again, not to go back on that, but we are science forward, right? Like I
Yes.
believe that we need to look at science for where it's at, and then we need to be ahead of that, right? That's what we do as designers. So AI might help us to be like a little bit ahead of that as well and understand what that means. We just need to make sure that it can give us something that's of value. We use it to do iterative design thinking. We use Gemini to generate a framework for what we're going to respond to in terms of some questions, whether that's like generating a response for a work plan, right?
Mhm.
Like, and then we go, maybe not. But the nice thing about some of these tools is that they're in your environment. And so they're referencing all of the stuff that I have, right? So it's enterprise. And that means someday, in theory, our entire catalog of designs are something that becomes referential to the AI in order for us to think about where we're kind of taking the designs from there. So it
Yeah.
is reinforcing brand. It
Sure.
may be reinforcing that after I'm long gone, right? But I
Yeah, you're
do
right.
think that most firms do that regardless. I think it may become a more precise tool. I think there's tons of decisions to be made when that starts doing that, like as to like whether or not that is informative of that place. So places are dynamic. What you're going to get is a historical feedback from AI, and then how that melds is. I mean,
Right. No, I
I'm
mean, because
super interested to figure out what
no, no,
happens. Right?
no, it's interesting because for you, right, you've got this firm and you've got whatever, maybe hundreds of case studies of projects you worked on, and all that stuff can be fed into some conceptual LLM to
Yeah.
then have some framework about what your firm is and what they do, and
Yeah.
what your work, what are the design signatures of your work and everything. But then it is sort of interesting. Like you could do that, and in some ways, that's kind of like your legacy. Because if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, it would
Yeah.
still it would still have a kind of digital twin of your design language, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but um, but then I do wonder if that's going to become some kind of terrible feedback loop for people.
Yeah.
Because,
Self-referential. I don't know.
especially because I think the pattern in architecture and engineering firms is that people are always leveling up until they become like the senior decision makers, but by the time they do, they're like very late in their career, and they might just be like, oh, let the AI do it, I have to go play golf, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I will say, like, we have a little challenge. And again, it's to encourage to explore the tool.
Yeah.
Tools are there. Tools have been built. Explore the tool. Like that, I think is my biggest message in like in some of the AI. And that is like we did like it was really just a funny idea, but I said, okay, we had a small residential project, and the client said, I just want some sort of real like foresty little like tree house playhouse like in the woods for my kids. And he was actually an architect, and I was like, don't you want to design it? And he's like, no, I want to see what your idea is. I said, okay. And I said, all right, we're all going to do a race. I'm going to use AI because I kind of know where I want this to go. But you guys come up with your own idea, and then all three will look at all of our ideas, and then we'll vote on whose is the best.
Yeah.
And I like blew
You
them
win.
away. I blew them away by a million. But that means that. But of course, that is because like I have experience. I kind of know what the client wants. right?
Yeah.
I kind of like presented this like really luscious, like growing tree fort thing, and it was all AI, like, and
It was
and
AI
he's
that
like,
was probably trained on your work, right?
yeah, I mean, and so right, and so like it, and also like I kind of knew that I could get it to a certain visual quality where they were going to have to like kind of do it in a more manual way. So you add time plus some knowledge and the willingness to work with something, you can get a pretty cool image. But that's what you get. It doesn't tell you how to build that.
No, of course, of course.
It
It's
doesn't get you to code. It doesn't do any
it's
of the things that you really need to do in order to make it a reality.
right. I know, but it's just it's like it's pushing the easy button. So
Yeah.
I mean, I can see the temptation to push the easy button all the time, and then you don't actually have to do any original thought of your own.
Yeah.
And your creativity starts to atrophy in certain ways, I think.
No, yeah, I mean, it has to be in support of a creative agenda that
Yeah,
is run by us. I mean, otherwise, what are we doing? Right? Like there's no, the machines aren't designing for humans. They're just like trying to figure out how we think in order to design like us. But we have it up on that. So that's the thing. If you can direct it and you can make sure that it is like, I mean, there's a bunch of stupid tasks that we could get rid of.
yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
But the creative things, the things that it wants to do, like we should probably make sure that we're still in the driver's seat. Like, why doesn't that thing learn? Why can't it like wash dishes? That's what I want it to do, right? Why
Exactly.
can't it
Right.
do all the stupid shit that I don't want to do?
Yeah.
It seems to be
Right, yeah.
relegating
It's coming
all of
after
the
the
stupid
artists and
shit to
creators.
us, and it's not doing any of the, it wants to do all the cool stuff. It's like a younger brother, right? It's just like it wants to be like us, do all the cool stuff, and
Yeah,
it doesn't,
yeah. Well, I mean, I want a AI to wash my dishes so I can go out and make paintings and music.
Yeah,
And
right, exactly, right. Because there is a real need. We have such an interesting way of processing information and how we turn that in creativity. I'm not sure that that's going to be replicated anytime soon. I think that's so far behind. I mean, anyone that talked about AI back in the day, whether that's Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, they said, if you want to create AI, you need to replicate the human mind.
Yeah, well,
And like that's not what's happening, so it's like,
it gets back to that kind of like iterative loop of like if the AI starts, recreating Scott Bishop's design style, and then you can have a fairly realistic Scott Bishop design style, but then once that just starts, regurgitating itself over and over again. I mean, for me, like I don't think I always had trouble like defining myself as an artist or designer because I never really wanted to do the same thing over and over again. I didn't want to just be the guy who makes the polka dotted mouse or whatever it is. And so because every couple of years I'm interested in something totally different and I just want to pursue that. I don't really care about the legacy or how all those things stack up against each other. I just kind of want to do what I want to do.
yeah.
But I don't think an AI is very good at replicating that type of intelligence.
No, there's a special sauce in there that hits a bunch of different parts of the brain that I think it's really hard to replicate.
Yeah.
And it's how we synthesize those things, right? How you synthesize all of that data, process it in a pretty efficient way, honestly, pulling out the things that are probably the most critical, and then like adding a creative spin to that, thinking about how you add form to that, and then actually accomplishing that, right? Like that is really the special thing about us as a species. And as a human ecologist, I support our endeavor because like I'm in support of our species, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, anyway, what I'm always, just to wrap up, I mean, what I'm always saying to everybody is, good data is what's going to give you project confidence, project reliability. And you've been sharing a lot of other forms of data I didn't even know existed, and thinking about data and the projection of data into the future and the past. And really interesting to hear about all these projects, and very much looking forward to learning more about it, especially the Point project. That's very exciting to think that, you're really designing kind of on the level of Olmsted or some of these other really classic landscape designers. And it's amazing to hear a little bit about how that's happening in 2025. So thank you so much for your time today, Scott. It's great to hear about this.
No, thanks for having me on, Owen. Much appreciated.
Yeah. And anyway, hope to catch up with you soon, Scott. And that's a Practice Forward podcast for you. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.